Hey, my name is E.K. Brummel. I'm 33 years old, and I drive a school bus. Route 3, Coldbrook R3, Sawyer County, Missouri, 41 miles of gravel and blacktop, 38 kids, 2 railroad crossings and 1 low-water bridge that floods every spring like it's got an appointment. I'm also the man who fixes the buses. Because in a district our size, the driver and the mechanic and the guy who shovels the lot are all the same person, and that person is me. Which means my entire job, the whole thing, every morning and every afternoon of my life, is bringing other people's children home to their mothers. That's the joke, if you want one. I'll wait while you get it. This all happened last year. October 14th, a Tuesday, 3:15 in the afternoon, in the pickup lane outside the elementary building with about 11 parents standing around, and the flag rope tapping against the pole the way it does when the wind comes off the bean stubble. I've got a daughter, Hazel. She was 6 then, 1st grade, front tooth missing on the left side. And she'd been mine alone since she was 2.5. Her mother's name was Dina. Dina decided somewhere in the spring of Hazel's 3rd year that she hadn't signed up for a house at the end of a gravel road with a man who smells like diesel, and I've never once been able to argue with the accuracy of that. She signed the papers in Kirksville with a lawyer's pen, and she has sent a card at Christmas every year since, and the cards are nice, and they are addressed to Hazel, and they say love Dina, and Hazel has never once asked me why they don't say anything else. The word mom did not exist in my house. Not as an absence even, it was just a word other kids used. The way other kids used words like cabin and Disney and grandma's pool. Hazel's teacher that year was Willa Terhune. 31, 3rd year in the building, 1st grade, came to us from a bigger district over in Adair County because her aunt got sick, and then because she stayed. She wore the same gray cardigan 4 days out of 5, and she kept a coffee can of sharpened pencils on the corner of her desk, and she is the only teacher I have ever met who learned all 38 of my bus kids' names by the end of September, including the ones who weren't hers. So, October 14th. 3:15, I'd run my morning route, and then spent the day flat on my back under bus 2 with a leaking wheel seal, and I'd come up to the school on foot from the bus barn with grease on my forearms to get Hazel, because on Tuesdays I picked her up instead of putting her on my own bus. That was a small thing I did for her. 1 day a week she got to be a kid whose dad came and got her like everybody else's. The doors opened and the 1st graders came out in that shuffling line they do, and Miss Terhune was at the front holding the door with her hip, calling names, matching kids to cars. Hazel came out 3rd or 4th, and there was a puddle right there where the sidewalk dips, from the rain the night before, and Hazel went into it, not fell, just misjudged it, both feet, all the way to the ankle. Brand new shoes. She made a sound, not a cry, the sound before the cry, and she turned around, back toward the door, back toward the room, the way kids do when the world gets suddenly wrong, and she said it. Mom, my shoes. Just like that, flat and ordinary and not asking for anything. The way you'd say it to somebody who was already going to fix it. And Willa Terhune bent down and took Hazel's hand and walked her 4 steps back onto dry concrete and said, I know, honey, let's get you out of that. And she crouched there in front of my daughter in the doorway with the wind coming across the parking lot, and she took off Hazel's shoes and knocked them against the brick and pulled her socks straight and put them back on her. And never said one word about the name. And I stood 20 feet away with my hands in my coat pockets, and I didn't say anything either. I want to be very clear about this, because it's the whole thing, and because later on it got repeated in this county about 900 times by people who weren't standing there. I had about 2 seconds. 2 seconds where I could have laughed and said, Hazel, honey, that's Miss Terhune, and everybody would have laughed with me, and Hazel would have gone red and forgotten it by supper, and none of the rest of it would have happened. 2 seconds is plenty. I've had less time than that to decide whether a car was going to stop at a crossing. I let it go by. I let it go by because I have been the child in that doorway, and I have been corrected, and I know exactly what it costs. Willa stood up. She looked at me over the top of my daughter's head, and I looked back at her, and neither of us moved our faces at all. Then she said, "Have a good afternoon, Hazel," and Hazel said, "Bye." And that was it. Hazel walked to me and took my hand with her wet socks squelching and started telling me about a bird that had gotten into the gym. Charlene Ruble was standing 8 feet behind me with her keys in her hand. Charlene isn't a bad woman. I want that on the record too. She subs in the office. She runs the concession stand at ball games. She has buried a husband and raised 4 boys, and she does not have one mean bone that I've ever found. Charlene didn't go home and make a phone call. Charlene didn't do anything at all for 3 weeks. But in the first week of November, Gail Mesher, our elementary principal, 31 years in that building, a woman who has been telling children to walk on the right side of that hallway since before I was in it, asked Charlene in a completely different conversation about something completely different whether she'd noticed anything unusual in the pickup line. And Charlene, who does not lie, said, "Well, the Brummel girl calls Miss Terhune mom." That is the entire origin of it. One honest woman answering one direct question. Now I need to back up, because to understand why a 5-second thing in a doorway turned into a 9-month problem, you have to understand 2 pieces of paper, and I only understood one of them at the time. The first piece of paper is yellow. Every district's got a version of it. Ours is a 5x8 card in a green file box on the counter in the elementary office, and it has the student's name across the top, and the parent or guardian, and the home address, and the phone numbers, and then down at the bottom there's a section with 4 blank lines under a heading that reads persons authorized to receive the student. 4 lines. Most families fill in all 4. Grandma, aunt, neighbor lady, the friend whose kid plays ball with yours. It takes 90 seconds. On Hazel Brummel's card there was 1 line filled in, and it said Isaac D. Brummel, father, and the other 3 lines were blank, and they had been blank since the first day of kindergarten. That was not an accident, and it was not an oversight. I did that on purpose. Every August I sat at that counter with the pen on the chain, and I looked at those 3 empty lines and I left them empty, and if you'd asked me why, I'd have told you there wasn't anybody to put on them, and that would have been a lie. Because I had a cousin in town and a neighbor a half-mile down, and an aunt in Novinger who'd have driven through a hailstorm. The truth is that after dinner, I decided something without ever saying it out loud, which is the most dangerous way to decide anything. I decided that if there was exactly one person in the world who could come and get my daughter, then there was exactly one person in the world who could fail to. I made myself the only door. I told myself it was devotion. 4 years I ran that route and fixed those buses and put my own kid on my own bus every day but Tuesday, and I thought I was being her father. I was being her insurance policy. There's a difference, and I paid for it in January. And I'll get to that. The second piece of paper I didn't know about until spring, and it was in Willa Terhune's desk drawer the entire time. Second week of September, before any of this, she'd done a lesson with the first graders. Basic stuff. Learn your address. Learn a phone number. Learn the names of the grown-ups in your house. She'd made up a practice card that looked like the real one, mimeographed off. Practice printed across the top in her own handwriting. And the kids filled them in with fat pencils, and she went around and helped them spell. There was a line on it that said mother. Every kid in that room wrote something on that line. 12 of them wrote a name. 1 of them wrote Nana. Hazel Brummel sat there with the eraser end in her mouth for most of the period, and then near the end she wrote, in that shaky 6-year-old print that goes uphill, Miss Terhune, and she put a little heart next to it. Because she was 6, Willa collected the cards. She was supposed to send them home in the Friday folders so the parents could check the phone numbers. She sent 13 of them home. She put the 14th in the middle drawer of her desk, under the stapler, and she never showed it to a soul. I've thought about that drawer more than almost anything else in this story. Because here's what she was doing, and she told me this later. In a parking lot with her hands shaking, she was protecting me. She'd never met me except as a man who waved at her from a bus. She figured the card would land on my kitchen table on a Friday night, and I'd read it, and it would hurt me in a way she had no business causing. So she took the hit herself and stuck it in a drawer, and in doing that, she created a document. In a school. About a child. That she did not disclose. You can see it right, from where you're sitting you can see it plain. She could not, and I could not, because when you are inside a kindness, it does not look like a file. The first week of November, Gail Mesher called Willa into her office at 7:40 in the morning and shut the door. I got my version of that meeting 3 days later, in the bus barn, from Gail herself, who drove down and stood in the doorway in her good coat with the diesel smell all around her, and did not sit down. She said, "Ike, I need to say a thing to you, and I need you to hear it as procedure and not as an accusation." I said, "All right." She said, "Your daughter is calling her teacher mom in front of other adults. Miss Terhune has been given direction. She's not to have contact with your family outside of school hours or school business, not the library on Saturdays, not the ball field, nothing, and I need you to not put her in a position, because she's a probationary teacher and I am the person who has to write the recommendation on her in the spring." I said, "Gail." She crouched down and fixed my kid's shoes. And Gail Mesher looked at me for a long second and said, "In 2011 I had a teacher in this building who fixed a lot of shoes." That's all she said about it. It took me until February to learn the rest, and when I did, I stopped being able to be angry at her, which was inconvenient, because being angry at her was the only comfortable thing I had. Here's what happened in 2011, and I'm telling it because Gail deserves the whole picture and not the cardboard version people in town made of her. There was a 4th grade teacher, I'm not going to say the name, half the county already knows it and the other half has no business, who took an interest in a boy whose home situation was bad, in the way that everybody knows about and nobody can prove. She started keeping him after school. Then she started driving him. Then she was buying his clothes. And then there was a summer where he was at her house more than his own, and Gail Mesher watched all of it and wrote none of it down, because every single piece of it was good. And then in August that teacher's husband took a job in Springfield, and they moved, and that boy lost the only steady adult he had ever had, in 1 week, with no warning, because there was no arrangement. There was only kindness, and kindness isn't a legal instrument. He quit coming to school in the spring of 7th grade. Gail told me she has his file in her bottom drawer at home, not the school's copy, her own. She said, everybody's very sure the rule is cruel until they've watched what happens without it. So that's the wall we hit, not a villain. A woman with a file in a drawer at home, and a mandate she'd earned the hard way. November and December were bad in a small, grinding way that I didn't recognize as bad while it was happening. Willa followed the direction to the letter, and she followed it in the worst possible way, which was correctly. She stopped saying good morning to me at the door. She stopped putting notes in Hazel's folder that said anything but the required thing. There was a Saturday reading hour at the Coldbrook Branch Library that Willa had run for 2 years, volunteer, on her own time, and Hazel had gone to every one of them since kindergarten, and Willa stopped running it, just handed it off to a lady from the Methodist church and stopped. And Hazel, who is 6 and who has no framework for administrative direction, concluded the only thing a 6-year-old can conclude. She got quiet. She quit asking me to read at night. She started saying she had a stomachache on Tuesdays, which was the day I picked her up, and I didn't put that together for 5 weeks. 5 weeks. I'm a man who can hear a wheel bearing going bad at 40 miles an hour, with the windows up, and I could not hear my own kid. Dub Hassenfratz drives Route 1. He's 71, taught shop in that building for 26 years before his knees quit, and now he drives mornings for gas money and something to do. We eat lunch in the barn out of a cooler, most days, and around the 10th of December he set his sandwich down and said, "You know what she did wrong." I said, "Who?" He said, "Don't." I said, "She didn't do anything wrong. She fixed a shoe." And Dub said, "Not her. You." He pointed his thumb at the wall in the general direction of the school. "That card in the office has got one name on it. I've been in this district 40 years, boy. There's kids in that box with 6. You've got one." He picked his sandwich back up. "You made it so there's nobody to be mad at but you if it ever goes wrong. That ain't safety. That's just you wanting to be the only one that matters." I told him to eat his lunch. I thought about it every night for 6 weeks, and I still didn't write anything on that card. January 21st. Ice storm. Not snow, ice, the freezing rain kind that comes in warm off the south and glazes everything and takes the power lines down in about 4 hours. Forecast had it starting at 3 in the afternoon. It started at 10:40 in the morning. The district called an early release at 11:15. That's a full route pull, all 4 buses, in conditions where you're doing 15 miles an hour with the chains on and stopping at the top of every hill to think about it. I had 38 kids on Route 3. Hazel was not one of them, because it was a Tuesday. 11 miles out, on the Farron blacktop, with 11 kids still aboard, I lost the air brakes on the front axle. A line let go. An 11-year-old line on a bus with 200,000 miles on it that I had personally flagged in the November inspection and personally been told to get another year out of. And I want to be honest and say I signed that inspection myself, and it was the right call at the time, and it was also the wrong call, and both of those things are true. I got that bus stopped on the shoulder with the parking brake, and I got 11 kids off it and into the Farron's front room, and I sat there with them for 4 hours while the county worked its way toward us with a sand truck. There is no cell service on the Farron blacktop. I want to say that plainly, because people who've never lived out here think a phone is a thing that works. I had a radio to the barn, and the barn had a phone, and the barn was one man who had gone to Kirksville for parts at 10 that morning. Meanwhile, at 11:20, the elementary office started calling homes. They got to Brummel. They pulled the yellow card out of the green box. There is one name on it. They called my house, nobody. They called my cell, nothing, no service. 4 rings and a recording. They called the bus barn, rang out. And then the office secretary, Rilla Pinkston, looked at the other 3 lines on that card, and the other 3 lines were blank, and Rilla Pinkston, who has been doing this job for 19 years and has never once in her life released a child to a person not on the card, closed the box and said, "She stays with us." By 12:30, the building was empty of children except mine. By 1 o'clock, the power was out, and they were running on the generator that keeps the office and the front hall lit. By 2, the custodian had gone home to his own family, and Gail Mesher was standing in the front hall with a flashlight and a 6-year-old and a hard decision. And Willa Terhune, who had a direction in her file, in writing, saying she was to have no contact with my family outside of school business, sat down on the floor of the front hall with her back against the trophy case and let my daughter fall asleep against her coat, and stayed there until 4:50 in the afternoon, when I came through those doors with ice in my eyebrows. She didn't take her home. She didn't take her to the teacher's lounge. She sat in the most public square footage in that building, in front of the principal, under the exit sign, and she did the one thing the direction did not have a word for, which was, be present. Hazel woke up when the door banged. She looked at me. And the first thing my daughter said, after 4.5 hours in a dark school, was not Daddy. She said, I told them you were coming. I got down on the tile in my wet coat, and I held on to her, and over the top of her head I looked at Willa Terhune, and Willa was already crying, and trying not to, in that awful contained way where you just keep blinking, and Gail Mesher stood 10 feet off, with the flashlight pointed at the floor and watched all three of us. I want to tell you that the storm fixed it. It did the opposite. Because on the 23rd, somebody, and I have never found out who, and I have decided I don't want to, and I mean that, put a written complaint in front of the Board of Education. Not about the storm, about the pattern. It said, in the flat language those things use, that a certified staff member had formed an inappropriate personal attachment to a student and the student's family, that a student had been observed publicly addressing her as mom with no correction, that the staff member had been given prior written direction on November 4th, and that on January 21st that direction had been disregarded. Every sentence of it was true. That's the part people don't understand about complaints in a small district. They aren't usually lies. They're true things arranged in an order. The board set a closed session for the second Monday in February. Personnel matter, which in Missouri means the public gets a door and not a whole lot else. And in the middle of getting ready for it, Willa did the thing that finished her, and she did it on purpose. Her association rep told her to hand over everything she had, and Willa Terhune walked into that office and put the practice card on the desk. The one from September, with Miss Terhune in uphill printing and a little heart, that had been under a stapler in her drawer for 5 months. She could have burned it. It was a mimeographed practice sheet in a first-grade classroom. There is no world in which anybody would ever have asked. She put it on the desk and said she should have sent it home in September, and that she hadn't because she was afraid it would hurt the girl's father. Her rep put his head in his hands. I found out about the card the same week. Willa called me, school business, technically, because she called from the office phone with Gail standing there, which tells you everything about how those two women handled the worst month of their professional lives. She said, there's something in the file with your daughter's handwriting on it, and you should hear it from me before you hear it read out loud. I met her in the lot behind the Caseys that night, because there was nowhere in Coldbrook to have a conversation that wouldn't be a conversation. She had the copy. I read it under the dome light of my truck with the engine running. Mother, Miss Terhune. I'm not going to pretend I was fine. Willa said, I've never spoken one word to her about it. Not one. Ike, I want you to believe that. I never corrected her, and I never encouraged her, and I have gone over every single day since September, looking for the place where I did something, and I can't find it, and that scares me worse than if I could. And I said the truest thing I've ever said to another adult. I said, you didn't do it. I did. Because here's what I'd finally worked out. Somewhere around 1 a.m. on the 22nd of January, while my daughter slept in my bed with all her clothes on. Hazel didn't put Willa Terhune on that line because Willa did anything. She put her there because that line existed and had to have something on it, and because a 6-year-old fills in a blank with the closest true thing she's got. Willa was just the nearest woman who had never once, in 8 months, been in a hurry. And the reason there was nobody else in the running, no aunt, no neighbor, no name on the card, no grandma with a pool, is that I had spent 4 years building a life with exactly one adult in it, and then I'd handed that life to a child and expected her not to notice the size of it. I have not told you yet why I didn't correct her in the doorway. I said I'd get to it. This is where it goes. I was raised by my aunt, Verna Brummel, my dad's sister, out on the Novinger Road. My mother left in the fall of 1998, when I was 5, for reasons that were hers and that I have never particularly needed, and my father was a man who worked and drank and did neither of them badly enough to be interesting, and Verna took me the way people took kids out here then, which is to say without paperwork. When I was 8, at the counter of the EMFA in Novinger, with 3 men standing there, I asked Verna for something. I don't even know what, a pop, a candy bar, and I called her Mom. I didn't decide to. It came out. And Verna Brummel, who fed me and raised me and sat up with me through pneumonia and buried my father and paid for the class ring I still can't find, put her hand flat on the counter and said, in front of those 3 men, "Now, honey, I'm your aunt." Kind voice. Completely kind. Not one hard edge on it. I never called her anything but Verna again in my life. Not once, not in 25 years. And I want to be clear that she never knew that she'd done anything at all. So in October, in that doorway, in my 2 seconds, what I was actually looking at was not my daughter's teacher. It was a woman about to put her hand flat on a counter. And I did not let it happen, and I would not let it happen, and I'd do it again, and it cost another woman her career. And all 3 of those things are also true at the same time. I drove out to Novinger in February and asked Verna about it. She's 79 now and she still splits her own kindling, which is a fight we have annually. She thought about it for a long time. Then she said, "I remember." I said, "You remember?" She said, "Isaac, I have thought about that day at the EMFA for 30 years. She looked at the window. Your mother was 200 miles away and she was alive. And I thought if I let you say it, you'd stop waiting for her, and then one day she'd come back through and you'd have quit. I thought I was holding your place." She said, "I've never known if I was right. I don't expect I ever will." Then she said, "But nobody came back through, did they?" We sat there a while. She made me take a pie home. The Monday after that was the board meeting, and it did not go the way the town had it going. Because Willa Terhune stood up in that closed session. I wasn't in the room. I got it from her and from Gail both, and their 2 accounts match, which in this county is practically notarized, and before the board could take any action at all, she withdrew. She told them she was withdrawing her application for tenure, she was completing the school year, and she had accepted a position at Sawyer City K through 8 for the fall. 22 miles east. She had already interviewed. She had already been offered it. She'd done it 2 weeks before, without telling anybody, including me. She did it that way for a reason, and she told me the reason afterward, and I have never gotten over it. She said, "If they vote on me, then what happened here is something that was done to me, and Hazel is going to grow up in this town and hear about it. If I go first, it's something I chose." The board accepted her withdrawal. The complaint was closed with no action. There's a letter of direction in her file, dated November 4th, and it will sit there for 3 years and then it goes away. And the rest of it, the storm, the haul, the card, is not written down anywhere, except in the memory of about 9 adults. It cost her a year on her tenure clock and about $6,000 in the pay scale difference, and it cost her the building she'd wanted to teach in until she was old. And it meant that from the last day of school in May, she was no longer my daughter's teacher, and there was no rule anywhere on God's earth about who she could be after that. I need to tell you about one conversation with Hazel, because everything I've said so far is adult business, and the actual story here belongs to a 6-year-old who never got a vote in any of it. It was March. We were in the kitchen. She was drawing. She said, without looking up, "Am I allowed to call her that?" I said, "Call who what, hun?" She said, "You know." I sat down across from her, and I told her about the EMFA in Novinger, and Aunt Verna, and the 3 men and the hand on the counter. I told her the whole thing, in 6-year-old words, which took about 4 minutes, and which was the hardest 4 minutes of my adult life. Then I said, "So when you said it, I decided I wasn't going to be the man who put his hand on the counter. And that was my decision, and it turned out to be a big one, and some grown-ups had to pay for it. But it was mine. It was never yours. You didn't do anything wrong, Hazel, not one single thing. She thought about it the way she thinks about things, which is with her whole face. Then she said, "But is it allowed?" And I said, "Not yet. Right now she's your teacher, and there's rules about it, and the rules aren't stupid, they're just not about us." I said, "But not yet isn't no." She said, "Okay," and she went back to drawing. That's it. That's the whole conversation. 6-year-olds will accept almost anything if you don't lie to them about which part is theirs. April 11th, a Thursday, I walked up from the bus barn on my lunch, and I stood at the counter in the elementary office and asked Rilla Pinkston for the card. She got the green box out and thumbed to the B's and set it in front of me and gave me the pen on the chain, and she did not ask me one question, because Rilla Pinkston has worked that counter for 19 years, and she knew exactly what was about to be written on it, and she had known since January. I wrote on the second line, Willa Terhune. Then I wrote on the third line, Verna Brummel, Great Aunt Novinger. Then I wrote on the fourth, Dub Hassenfratz. Rilla stamped it and initialed the change and put it back in the box. Gail Mesher was standing in her office doorway the whole time, with a cup of coffee. She didn't come out. When I turned around, she looked at the card in Rilla's hand, and then at me, and she gave me one nod, the smallest thing, an inch, and went back in and shut her door. 2 weeks later, a manila envelope showed up in Hazel's Friday folder with no note in it. Inside was the practice card. The original. Not a copy. Uphill printing. Little heart. I have thought 100 times about what it cost that woman to take a document out of a personnel matter she had run herself and put it in a first grader's folder and never once mention it to anybody. I've never asked her. I never will. Some people say what they've got to say with a nod in a doorway, and you take it. Willa started at Sawyer City in August. I asked her out in June, 11 days after the last day of school, and I did it badly, standing in the gravel at the co-op with a load of feed in the truck. And she said yes before I'd finished the sentence, which is the only reason I got through it. We were careful for a long time. Not because anybody was watching anymore, although in Coldbrook somebody is always watching, but because Hazel had already lost one adult out of a doorway, and I was not going to run that experiment on her twice. Willa said it plainer than I could. She doesn't need me to be exciting. She needs me to be boring for about 2 years. So that's what we did. Boring, Sunday suppers. Homework at the kitchen table. Willa at the ball field in a folding chair with the other adults, not on the field. 22 miles each way, 4 days a week, all through that first winter. We got married the following June, in the yard, with about 40 people. Verna came and sat in the front row and cried the entire time and denied it afterward. Dub gave a toast that went on too long and had a bus in it. Charlene Rubel did the food and would not take $1. Gail Mesher came, stayed 45 minutes, drank 1 cup of coffee, said, "Congratulations, Ike," and left before the dancing. Hazel was 8 by then, and she'd had 2 years by then to work out what she wanted to call anybody, and nobody asked her to hurry and nobody asked her to decide. And I want to say for the record that we both told her, more than once, that Willa was fine. That Willa had always been fine, that there was no test. The morning of the wedding she came into the kitchen while I was doing my tie in the window reflection. She said, "Is it allowed now?" And I said, "Yeah, Hazel, it's allowed now." And she said, "Okay," and went to find her. That was 15 months after a puddle in a pickup lane. I have run the numbers on it more than once, at 15 miles an hour on the Farron blacktop, with a load of kids behind me. And I always come out the same place. 2 seconds in a doorway. That's all it was. 2 seconds where the correct, professional, sensible, protective thing to do was open my mouth. And I didn't. And a good woman lost the classroom she loved and a year off her clock, and about $6,000. And I will be paying attention to that for the rest of my life. But there's a yellow card in a green box on a counter in Coldbrook, Missouri, with 4 names on it now instead of 1, and my daughter has never once in her life had to look at a blank line and guess. If I've got to choose which of those 2 things I'd undo, I don't.